Welcome to Time of Death. This video is for informational purposes and in no way meant to glorify or condone violence. In today's video, we'll be discussing the murder of Stanley Osvaldo Montes. Montes was shot and killed on Monday, January 4, 2016, near South Figueroa Street and West 42nd Place in Vermont Square, according to LA County Coroner records. Darian Daniel was subsequently arrested and charged with the murder. The following is the evidence at trial. At around 4 a.m. on December 20th, 2015, Yoshino was driving for Uber when he picked up three young black male passengers at 46th Street and Vermont Avenue in Los Angeles. One man, who Yoshino later identified as defendant, sat in the front passenger seat and instructed Yoshino to drive into an alley and to stop the car. Defendant pulled out a gun and pointed it at Yoshino, demanding his wallet and cell phones. A man in the back seat reached into Yoshino's pocket and took his wallet while defendant grabbed Yoshino's two cell phones. Defendant ordered Yoshino to get out of the car and lie face down on the ground while the three men discussed whether to shoot him. The men brought Yoshino back to the car, demanded his ATM pin, and held him in the back seat at gunpoint. Defendant drove the car to a nearby convenience store, where he and another man withdrew $300 from Yoshino's bank account. They got back into the car, and defendant resumed driving. Defendant told the two men in the back seat with Yoshino to, quote, "do your thing." The men in the back seat punched Yoshino in the head. Defendant stopped the car, and the men in the back seat dragged Yoshino out of the car and onto the ground. Defendant stomped on Yoshino's head, knocking him unconscious. When Yoshino regained consciousness, his car and the three men were gone. Yoshino identified defendant in court as the front passenger who pulled the gun on him the night of the carjacking. Yoshino testified that when he regained consciousness after the carjacking, he walked to a nearby business and called 911. The responding police officers drove Yoshino around the area so he could point out where the night's events took place. Yoshino saw his car traveling in the police patrol car's direction. Yoshino's car pulled into a nearby driveway, and the driver got out and fled the scene. The driver's clothes looked like those worn by the front passenger who pulled the gun on Yoshino that night. Investigators recovered one of Yoshino's cell phones and a convenience store receipt from his car. Investigators identified two suspects based on latent fingerprints pulled from Yoshino's car and showed Yoshino two six-pack photographic lineups about a month after the carjacking. Yoshino testified he recognized the defendant's photograph in the first lineup as the front passenger who pulled the gun on him the night of the carjacking, and he identified one of the defendant's accomplices in the carjacking in the second lineup. At around 7 p.m. on January 4th, 2016, victims Stanley Montes, Munoz, Fernando, and Albert were playing basketball on a parking lot court near 42nd Place and South Figueroa Street in Los Angeles. Garcia sat courtside and filmed the game on the victim's cell phone. Two black men approached Garcia and demanded his cell phone. Garcia complied. The two men approached the victim on the court. One of the men, who Fernando, Albert, and Garcia later identified as defendant, held a gun. Defendant argued with the victim. Defendant then fatally shot the victim several times in the chest before leaving the scene with the other man. Fernando and Albert identified defendant in court as the person who shot the victim and took Garcia's cell phone. Albert testified that 3 days after the shooting, he saw a man on the street who had been involved in the shooting. He placed an anonymous 911 call reporting his sighting. In the second 911 call, Albert reported that police had detained the man he had seen. Police detectives were interviewing Fernando about the shooting when Albert made his 911 calls. Detective Christopher Courtney testified that during the interview, they received a radio call stating a suspect in the shooting was detained nearby. Detectives transported Fernando to where defendant was detained for a field show-up. An FBI special agent, who was a member of the agency's cellular analysis survey team, testified he analyzed defendant's cell phone records and determined defendant's cell phone was pinging cell towers close in time and proximity to both the carjacking and the murder. Following the trial, the jury found defendant guilty on all counts and found true the gun allegations. The court sentenced defendant to a prison term of 50 years to life on count 1, the murder, plus 13 years on count 2, the robbery, and imposed a life term plus 10 years on count 3, the aggravated kidnapping for robbery. Stanley Osvaldo Montes was 25 years old at the time of death.